Hello, everybody. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. Today, our webinar topic is Critical Concepts, the Role of Post-Market Activities in Establishing Data Sufficiency. We are proud to announce that Criterion Edge has been awarded Company of the Year among top regulatory services companies. So how can we help you? If you'd like to speak with us about your upcoming projects or regulatory writing needs, we would be happy to book an appointment with you. You can email us for a free 30-minute consultation at consult@criterionedge.com. You can also book a meeting time directly with the link that we will send in the chat. Our first presenter today is Dr. Sarah Chavez, Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience, and she has taught at the university level for 20 years. Sarah has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. Also joining us today is Stacy Beecham, Regulatory Affairs Consultant with Criterion Edge. Stacy has a BS in biology and an MS in human physiology with extensive experience in regulatory writing and 10 years of experience in international regulatory affairs. Stacy was a medical researcher prior to entering the regulatory space where she worked with physicians and scientists at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. Stacy's expertise in regulatory affairs, submission writing, clinical research, and regulatory consulting for medical device, biopharma, and biotech makes her a valuable asset to our team. And now I will welcome our speakers to give an overview of our session today.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. So in today's session, we are going to be covering the role of post-market surveillance requirements under IVDR and MDR. And specifically, we hope to address some of the similarities and differences between these two regulations so that we can describe how post-market surveillance contributes to data sufficiency in either the CER or the PER. So in today's presentation, we will first describe the actual post-market surveillance requirements under both MDR and IVDR. Then we will clarify the difference between some of these various reports, including the PMSR, the PSUR, and the PMCF or the PMPF. And then finally, we hope to pull it all together by explaining how these activities can be used to support your data sufficiency within your report, your CER or your PER. So today we're going to be describing PMS in the context of both MDR and IVDR. So we thought it would be helpful to begin by directly comparing these two regulations. IVDR has actually been harmonized with the MDR, particularly in regards to the requirements for clinical and performance evaluations and these post-market requirements. So both regulations seek to set up a regulatory system that will help increase the safety and efficiency in the European medical device market. Both of these regulations will include collecting clinical evidence and demonstrating that you have an acceptable risk-benefit profile compared to other medical devices. And in addition, both of these regulations set up very strict and very detailed post-market surveillance and vigilance requirements. So as you can see here, there are some differences in terms of the classifications and the types of data. The CER will be based on clinical data informing on the safety and performance of a medical device, whereas the PER uses performance data for both analytical and clinical performance data. So ultimately, this data must establish that a device performs as intended and may be considered state-of-the-art. But today we wanted to focus on this last point in the list, the post-market surveillance.
Thanks, Sarah. Post-market surveillance, or PMS, is defined in the European Medical Device Regulation as all activities carried out by the manufacturer to institute and keep up to date a systematic procedure to proactively collect and review experience gained from devices they place on the market. Now, PMS may seem a little daunting, but I think it's better to think of it as a tool rather than a burden, because ultimately, PMS allows you to analyze and document any and all adverse events happening in situations where devices are being used in a real-world setting. It is a mandatory process under practically every global regulation, but it can also be an incredibly effective tool to help establish data sufficiency or to show when additional studies are needed. It is important to remember that any changes you make to your PMS plan also need to be backed into your current quality system. So Article 83 of the MDR, outlines the post-market surveillance system for the manufacturer, and the requirements there have changed just a little bit from the MDD requirements. And then Article 84 outlines the actual plan. And the key points that you'll want to include in your PMS plan are, of course, information concerning any serious incidents, adverse events, including information from your PSERs or any field safety corrective actions, any records referring to non-serious incidents and data on any undesirable side effects, information from trend reporting, relevant technical literature, databases or registers, information including feedback and complaints provided by users, distributors, and importers, and also publicly available information about similar medical devices. You'll notice that some of this information is considered to be collected proactively, and then some is considered to be collected reactively. Let's take a look at some of those examples.
So here are a side-by-side comparison of that proactive versus reactive data. In this case, you have the proactive data that consists of your post-market clinical follow-up, or PMCF. In the IVDR world, this would be your PMPF plan. You also have registry and registry studies, which can be a really helpful source of data. In some cases, you may identify data relevant to experience with similar devices, or even things like focus groups or customer surveys and user feedback. Those are all considered to be proactive because you are actively searching through existing literature to potentially identify a complication that could arise in the future. Now, the reactive ones, these are where an issue has been observed directly in the literature. So that could include complaint data. It could include other issues that were identified through manufacturing or service records. This is also where your vigilance reporting would come in, as well as a comprehensive review of the literature or national registries to identify any potential sources of the devices not performing as intended. So as Stacy mentioned earlier, one of the more important changes during that transition from MDD to MDR is this requirement to prepare your post-market surveillance reports and these periodic safety update reports for devices. And really, until MDR, this requirement had only been present in the pharmaceutical world. So a lot of what we've learned has been from our pharmaceutical friends as we're trying to make this transition. The PMSR applies to your low-risk devices. So that would be a Class 1 for MDR or a Class A and B IVD. It should be provided to the authorities if requested. And in contrast, the PSUR, that will apply to Class 2A, 2B, or Class 3 medical devices, or the Class C and D IVDs. And this should be generated annually, so be prepared to update this very regularly. The PMCF report is also part of this whole concept that this is a continuous clinical evaluation and life cycle management for your medical device. The PMCF will concern that proactive collection and analysis of the clinical data through the generation of real-world evidence on the safety and performance of the device under normal use in a real-world clinical setting. The PMCF requirements are much stricter than they were under MDD and certainly than they under IVD, where they basically were non-existent. So it is critical to consult those published guidances for PMCF. The risk of in vitro medical devices really depends so much on the type of device and the classification. So our post-market surveillance requirements are not quite as clearly defined as they are for medical devices. But we do know that a Class A IVD will require different types and levels of post-market surveillance activities than a Class D would. It's going to depend very strongly on your risk classification. And last, but certainly not least, we have vigilance reporting. Under MDR, vigilance is that reactive system by which the information is collected in the event of a serious incident, a complaint, or an adverse event. And the vigilance activities work much the same way for IVDs as they do for medical devices. The manufacturer must notify the national competent authority of any actions taken to reduce the risk of harm or serious deterioration of health. So that could be a field safety corrective action, and it must occur within the established timelines. Now, as you'll notice here, I've mentioned the gap. This is really the whole purpose of your quality management systems and each of these different buckets of data. You are hoping to identify and proactively address any concerns about gaps in your data set. So the clinical evidence will provide information from either your own in-house clinical studies, and or it could also include data that's been published and identified through systematic literature review. Then you're at the same time collecting data from your post-market surveillance, so your PMCF and your vigilance data. Now, there may not be sufficient data to support all indications or all populations, and those are the gaps that you're hoping to identify, but you also then must directly address how you're going to fill that gap within your CER or your PER. Now, many folks have asked, really, what is the main difference between MDR and IVDR? And ultimately, it lies in the timeline, first off. MDR has had a little bit of a head start on us, but there are also these minor details of the post-market surveillance and the post-market follow-up requirements, such as the specific content of the reports. And ultimately, this will really depend strongly on your device type and the risk classification.
Now, many of you have sent in questions about legacy devices. It's quite a hot topic right now, and I think the landscape is evolving. And as Sarah and I have seen in recent seminars and conferences that we've attended, there's a little bit of a gray area when it comes to legacy devices. So it's understandable that everyone has questions. So we thought we'd use this as an example of how to assess a gap for a type of device. Now, of course, you're going to be, just like Sarah said, assessing gaps in your PMS system, in your clinical data, in your quality system, and those things apply to all of your devices. But if you do have legacy devices that were currently previously certified under the MDD or the AIMDD directives, and now you're wondering if they meet the current MDR IVDR requirements, you'll need to perform a gap analysis. And sometimes that's something that's easily done, and you can handle it yourself and, you know, in-house. And then sometimes it's something that's a little more complicated, especially if you have devices that might kind of be in a gray area, borderline devices, which there's new guidance for that now as of September, MDCG guidance. So there are different things to consider there with gap analyses. They can be really complex or they can be more straightforward, and you need to decide, you know, whether that's something you need help with or something you can do yourselves. But once you conduct your gap analysis and you determine what the MDD requirements were and what your device data and your PMS and your QMS systems looked like at that time when it was certified, and then what they need to look like to meet the new MDR requirements to show conformity to the new GSPRs. So once you perform that gap analysis, you might say, yeah, I'm good to go. I can go talk to the notified body about MDR certification for my legacy device. We meet all the requirements. But you might say, I'm lacking in this area or this area, and one of the areas that is typical to be lacking in is clinical data. So how do we go ahead and get up to snuff with your clinical data sufficiency requirement? One way is to collect post-market clinical data that already exists through literature, through other people using your device in the real world setting, through surveys, through things like that. And then another way, of course, is to conduct a post-market clinical study. So when you're thinking about post-market clinical data collection, remember that it's real world experience from your device being used in humans or on humans. Other post-market data that you can collect could come from published clinical data, like I said, other real-world post-market data, and then your post-market study surveys, and then some of the other sources that we mentioned before. But make sure that your gap analysis identifies all the requirements that you currently don't meet, and then make sure that your clinical data meets those requirements.
So this is another question that comes up quite a bit under IVDR, particularly with folks hoping to avoid clinical studies. So as of last week, we attended a conference with BSI, and their main feedback was that IVDR requirements for legacy devices are identical to new devices. So if you are hoping to be grandfathered in under IVDD, that's not going to be a very viable option. So as you are going into IVDR and you are starting to set up your systems and trying to identify data, you will be required to have a PMS. You will also be required to do this whether you are legacy or not. The main way that we sort of distinguish between a device being legacy in the IVD world, the closest I've been able to come up with in terms of the regulation has been the definition of being established and standardized. You can be an established device, but not yet have standards, or you can be, you may have very clear standards that have been published by organizations and guidelines. So those can still be used to help you identify your acceptance criteria, but that doesn't negate the need for real world clinical data. So I definitely encourage all of our IVD clients to not think that just because your test has been on the market for 50 years, that you have a get out of data free card. You still are required to conduct the searches and the due diligence that is required from a PMS. So look at basically what amount and quality of available data exists. What is the available information compared to the current state of the art? And then also ensure that you have compliance in terms of your technical documentation for all of these reports under the new IVDR requirements. And be prepared because additional studies probably will be required. IVDD or FDA compliance does not qualify as being adequate under the new IVDR regulations in terms of your post-market surveillance.
When it comes to post-market activities, there are a lot of acronyms. And to drill down into the PMCF acronym, we just wanted to reiterate what that really is. A PMCF strategy or a PMCF plan is part of your PMS plan. And the purpose of it is to continuously confirm the safety and performance of your device in a real-world setting. And it helps manufacturers manage acceptable risk. The manufacturer should collect clinical data from the use in or on humans, as we said, after it has been commercialized, after it's been put on the market or put into service, and make sure it's within the intended purpose and the intended population that it's intended to treat, and that it's following a relevant conformity assessment procedure. The PMCF should be done with the aim of confirming all of your safety and performance objectives throughout the expected lifetime of the device. So it's a continuous process, as I mentioned. It should ensure that these are acceptable and that you're continually evaluating these objectives and updating them as needed. You're also evaluating any emerging risks that weren't present before, and you're collecting this fact-based evidence. Then you analyze the PMCF findings, you record the results, and then you keep them in your clinical evaluation report, which you of course update annually or semi-annually, depending on the classification of your device. And it's also part of your technical documentation. For class 3 and implantable devices, for example, the clinical evaluation report is updated annually. So you'll be annually analyzing that PMCF data.
And again, referring back to the IVDR requirements, according to Annex 8 or Annex 13, sorry, in IVDR regulations, the PMPF is going to be that continuous process, just as we saw with MDR. When conducting your PMPF, you are aiming to proactively collect and evaluate performance data, but also any relevant scientific data from the use of your device when it's used within its intended purpose or purposes, and as it's referred to in your conformity assessment procedure. So ultimately, your goal is to confirm the safety, performance, and the scientific validity throughout the expected lifetime of the device, and to ensure that you have continued to be acceptable in terms of your benefit risk ratio. And your goal really is to detect emerging risks on the basis of factual evidence. So just in practical terms, if you think of your device as being on the market for 50 years, we've come across some of these devices that have had published data that states that individuals who recently received a COVID vaccination may receive a risk of a false positive or a false negative result for certain assays. There is no way you could have anticipated that particular risk when your device went on the market, because that risk literally didn't exist. So that really illustrates the importance of this PMPF. You wouldn't know to warn against doing this test in an individual who's recently received their vaccination unless you were conducting this post-market performance follow-up. So some practical considerations as you're embarking on developing your PMPF. First off, determine whether or not it's required for your device, and that largely depends on your risk classifications. And then look to whether there are any gaps in the available data that demonstrate your device's performance and safety. That's going to be really critical. You may have plenty of data for one indication, but not another. You may even have one indication that's well established and standardized and another indication that's emerging. Those will all be identifiable through an effective post-market surveillance plan. But remember, if you decide that if you can justify that you don't need a PMPF, include that justification. Don't just leave it out. Make sure that you explain why no PMPF is needed. Don't assume that the notified bodies are going to make that extrapolation. You need to make sure that you have drawn very clear conclusions and justified why you are including or excluding something. And then finally, ensure that you have processes in place to determine when and if to undertake additional PMPF studies.
So we talked about the implications on your quality system if you were to make any adjustments to your PMS plan. We talked about the implications on, your clinical evaluation report, your technical documentation, but remember that any adjustments you make, any findings that you come up with from your post-market activities all need to be reflected in any report that you generate. So adjustments to all of the reports that are required post-market for under the new MDR will have to be made based on the new PMCF data that is generated as a part of your new PMCF plan, PMS plan, all of the activities involved with that. So let's talk about the purpose of the CER and the PER reports and how those are impacted. So CER report, clinical evaluation, talks about the clinical landscape for your device and what other alternatives and options are out there, and then how your device fits into that clinical landscape. Who does your device aim to treat? What's the population? What's the intended disease state that it's meant to treat? And how does that compare to other treatment options available? Now, the performance evaluation report is specific to the performance of your device. So those two reports are examples of reports that are impacted when you change your PMS plan or when you change your post-market activities or post-market clinical follow-up strategy. So to demonstrate that clinical performance of a device, you usually rely on a combination of sources. One would be the clinical performance studies that you may have performed. Another would be scientific peer-reviewed literature that you identified during your systematic literature review process. And in this case, you may have updated your systematic literature review from the original. And you may also rely on published experience gained by routine diagnostic testing, which could include data from registries and surveys. At least one of the listed methods must be used. Studies performed under IVDD, FDA, or other regulatory regimes may not qualify as clinical performance studies as defined in Annex 13, but they might be used as other sources of clinical performance data, which is also important. If you're going to use these other studies, scientific peer-reviewed literature and/or published experience gained by routine diagnostic testing must be used in combination. Explicit justification for not performing clinical performance studies is required.
So today we've tried to describe some of the fundamental requirements of the PMS system, but clearly this is a complicated topic. As we conclude today's webinar and open up to questions, let's first reflect on the intended purpose of the PMS. If you keep that in mind, that will definitely help you see the value that the PMS ultimately offers you in terms of your reporting. The PMS system itself is intended to continually re-verify and re-validate the results of your development phase by using real-world data. And your goal is to continually improve on the safety and performance of your device. You cannot be expected to anticipate all potential side effects or complications that could arise, but that's where PMS can help. The PMS system, it involves multiple processes and reports, but the PMS itself is not a process, and it's not an event or a report. It's the collection of all of these intersecting in complementary feedback loops. And these are going to provide a much longer response over the device lifetime than any single process by itself. So just remember that each of these reports are meant to be complementary and ensure that you can establish that data sufficiency by showing that you have sought out data from all of these sources. So therefore, when you're designing a PMS system, start by considering the types of information that these processes use as feedback. The feedback information requires that each process is different so that you cast a wide net. Risk management process requires information about the frequency and severity of harm that results from these devices, whereas manufacturing requires information about nonconformities. The clinical evaluation requires information on clinical performance, and so on and so on. So what that means is that the PMS system is producing many different types of feedback data. And to add to this complexity, the required feedback information isn't always available in the format that the processes need. So it must be produced by assessing these different sources of data. So think of things like the complaint data or the incident data. You need to have a system in place in which you're going to collect these data, but then also assess them in order to produce the necessary feedback to relay into this system. And to do that successfully requires a very comprehensive plan. You need to define what data you need to locate, the processes by which you're going to collect said data, and then the methods that you're going to use to assess your data. And ultimately, that will help you assess your data sufficiency.
We hope that today's webinar has been helpful in providing relevant advice and insights as to how post-market surveillance requirements compare between MDR and IVDR, clarifying the difference between PMSR, PSIR, PMCF, and PMPF, and explaining how these activities can be used to support data sufficiency within your CER or PER. We'd like to take the remaining time to answer some questions sent in by some of our webinar guests today.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. We will now turn to our Q&A portion, and we did take some time to review the questions that we received from you beforehand. But if you have questions now that the presentation is done, please go ahead and send them in using the Q&A button. I see some are already being sent in, so we'll run through as many as we can. And let's get started with our first question. Our first question today is, what do you do if you don't have sufficient clinical evidence?
Do you want me to take that, Sarah?
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Sure.
So yeah, if you want to cover it from the MDR perspective, then I will jump in for the IVDR, because I know we are definitely up against this particular hurdle.
Oh, sure. Yes. As far as the MDR is concerned, and I think we spoke to this a little bit in our presentation, but post-market clinical data collection would be key if you don't have sufficient clinical evidence anymore. If you were previously approved, if you don't have sufficient clinical evidence for a new device, then you'd probably have to perform that initial clinical study. They're getting stricter and stricter on that. So more and more studies, both pre-market and post-market, are becoming necessary.
Yes, and what we're finding in IVDR is that in many times you're sort of relying on the kindness of strangers to have used your device in a real world setting. There often isn't a significant amount of clinical evidence out there, but you really don't know what you have to work with until you start looking for it. So that's really where having a well-designed systematic literature review and knowing all of these data sources up front and doing a deep dive into all available data will help you go into the process knowing if there are going to be potentially some data gaps. So you don't want to jump the gun and start to plan a clinical study if it's not necessary. You may have evidence that's been published, but you won't know until you start looking.
All right, thank you. Moving on to our next question. This one is for you, Stacy. How can you identify gaps in vigilance, PMS, PMCF if you are not aware of them?
Sure. That's where the gap analysis really comes into play. It's a matter of comparing the MDR requirements for each of the categories to the MDD requirements, assuming you were in compliance with the MDD requirements, but just looking at the MDR, IVDR, I guess, requirements, and just seeing if you are meeting each of those. That's the basic answer. And if you're not sure, I would not hesitate to reach out to one of the many trained consultants that are out there. I'm sure if you Google, I know that BSI, for example, has these types of services, and I think a consultation would really get you on the right track.
Okay, great, thanks. This next question comes from Tim, and this is a question for you, Sarah. Would you explain how to determine if literature is peer-reviewed, please?
Yes, so this goes ultimately to your level of evidence. You want to ensure that you are being as objective as possible in the data that you're presenting, because you're using that data to develop your acceptance criteria by which your device is going to be measured. It's entirely possible you're going to come across instances where you will have a conference abstract. So that could be a paper, that could be a poster, or just an abstract. Those are not going to be peer-reviewed literature. So they're actually deemed to be a lower level of evidence. A peer-reviewed article is considered to be something that has been published in a journal and has undergone that process of being scientifically reviewed for its validity. So when you go to assess the overall quality of your data set, higher levels of evidence, such as clinical trials data, observational studies even, or systematic reviews and meta-analyses, are definitely going to be preferred. Those indicate that they've been reviewed by experts in the field and that they agree that the data is being presented properly and that the study design was adequate. So that's ultimately what they're looking for. They're not just looking for any, if you only have your own in-house data, that may not be sufficient for these clinical studies unless you can really justify how your clinical study was designed.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question from Natalie, and this is a good question for you, Stacy. Are all legacy devices wet?
Good question, Natalie. Definitely not. Remember that legacy devices means any device that has been previously certified under the MDD or AIMDD. And well-established technology has to meet certain criteria. The MDCG guidance specified 4 of the criteria, but it sounds like the notified bodies are evaluating these types of devices with pretty tough requirements. So even if you feel like you might meet the 4 criteria established in the MDCG guidance, my understanding is there are other factors that are to be considered. So well-established technology is a tough claim to make at the moment. They are adjusting the guidance in the next year or so to be clearer on what would be considered well-established technology or not. But at the moment, I would treat your device like a legacy device if it was previously certified and just go from there, and probably not try to make the well-established technology claim until that guidance is a little more clear.
Okay, great advice. Thanks. Our next question is from Karen. At what frequency should literature searches be done for established IVD devices?
So we've found that this may vary depending on the device. Generally speaking, we try to do several different literature searches. So we have a PICO search that looks at your state-of-the-art, the population, indications, comparators, and outcomes. That search we typically limit to 5 years in order to capture the most current data. But then we also look for guidelines. And in many cases, if you have a device that's been on the market for decades, they may refer to guidelines that have been published literally decades ago. And there may not have been a lot of movement or change since then. So often when we do a guideline search, we may extend that to go back a little bit further, maybe 10 years or even longer, depending on how long that device has been on the market. In terms of the competitor device, that we often try to limit to your competitors that have been published within the past 5 years, because standards change, guidelines change. If you're trying to make sure that you are capturing the most current data that exists and has been published and peer reviewed, you want to ensure that you are capturing the most recent data. So usually that 5-year range is a good place to start, but you will want to continue to update these. So if you do your report this year, to look back for 5 years, and then maybe in the following year, do a gap search that looks at what's been published in the year since the last update for your report. So the first one is always the hardest. The later updates to your PERs will be much easier because you'll just be doing these gaps to identify what's been published in the last year.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Our next question is from Morton, and he would like to know how to address quantifiable endpoints in a post-market setting. Stacy, would you like to take this one?
Sure. That's a great question. Generally speaking, your safety and performance endpoints that you established initially, at least for the primary safety and primary procedural or performance endpoints that you established for your initial clinical study, would be used in the post-market setting. If you are trying to adjust those endpoints, it's a good idea to add secondary endpoints, keep the same primary endpoints, and then add secondary endpoints if you want to evaluate other populations or maybe other indications for use with your device, and add those to your post-market clinical study. But I would keep the same primary endpoints as you initially defined.
All right, thanks, Stacy. Here's our next question from Clotilda. Is routine lab testing a good way to support clinical performance for established device for a rare disease?
Yes, this is going to be very tricky. When you come up with these rare diseases, there's often not a wealth of published clinical literature on your disease. And even if you are attempting to develop a clinical studies protocol, that could be very challenging because you're limited by the number of patients you would see. So you can use routine lab testing or observational studies or any type of peer-reviewed study that is maybe used retroactive testing or some sort of a historical view. Really, for these rare diseases, what I found is that meta-analyses can be a really good source of showing that sort of long-term pooled data sets. You'll often find those systematic literature reviews and meta-analyses. But in many cases, you may also have to refer to the standards and guidelines to identify your acceptance criteria. Now, if you don't have established standards and guidelines to fall back on, that's where it may be necessary to build off of a clinical study and actually develop a new clinical study to support your claims.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Our next question comes from Annalisa, and she would like to know, what are the applicable standards in MDCG? Stacy, would you like to take this one?
Sure. I think, Olivia, you have a link to the MDCG guidance. Could you please pop that in the chat?
Yes.
So that might be a good starting place if you wanted to know. There's a difference between the regulations that the European Commission publishes, such as IVDR, MDR, and the MDCG guidance. Generally speaking, the MDCG guidance further clarifies the regulations, but in some cases, it's a little bit different, addresses some different topics. But for the most part, it's meant to explain the regulations as they apply to our devices and to the real world situation. So definitely consult the MDCG guidance. It's a great tool to help understand what the regulations are trying to address and what the requirements are. As far as applicable standards go, there are several different sites you can use. There are several different software tools you can use. RIMSIS, for example, is one of those that helps identify applicable standards based on the risk classification for your device. But if you were to identify on your own what the initial standards might be, you could go to a site like techstreet.com, for example, to find the most recent version of those applicable standards. I know BSI has a compliance navigator website tool software package that helps identify applicable standards for depending on the risk classifications. And I'm sure there are many other tools out there. RegDesk has one. I would definitely consult a software tool like that, even on a trial basis, to kind of get an idea, because applicable standards are really important, and it's really important not to inadvertently omit any in your application packet, your pre-market application, whether it's a 510K or PMA or application for another country. Even applicable standards are really important. Another thing to keep in mind is there are harmonized versions of the standards. For example, they're called BSEN. Those are the standard, the harmonized version. So if you have an ISO standard like 14791, for example, there's a BSEN version of ISO 14791. So that's another factor that needs to be taken into account, whether there's a harmonized version that's globally recognized. And then there's a list, of course, that the FDA recognizes as the most recent standards, and you can find that on the FDA's website. So hopefully that helps to give you a couple of resources to look at when trying to identify applicable standards, and then be sure to review that MDCG guidance for clarity on any of the European directives and regulations.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy, for those resources, and be sure to look at that link that I sent in the chat as well. Moving on to our next question. How do you determine whether future PMCF is sufficient to fill a gap or whether that gap needs to be addressed prior to MDR transition or market release? And Sarah, would you like to take this one?
Yeah. I think in this case, you want to make sure that you are that the way that you have designed your plan is basically anticipating any potential complication that could arise in the future as a result of your test. Any reason why your test or your device may not perform as intended. So as you're developing your PMCF, you want to ensure that you're searching for these potential complications proactively and reactively. But then as you're preparing for this MDR transition, you may not be able to correct all of those gaps before you submit your application, but be sure to address them and not sort of ignore an obvious gap or shortcoming in the data. Clarify what exactly will be done to correct that data gap moving forward, and that will help with the sort of preventing them from having questions.
I agree. I'm going to add to that if that's okay.
Mhm.
I agree. If the notified body sees that you have a 1 year, 2 year, 5 year plan as to how to address any gaps or insufficiency, I think that they are a lot more willing to work with you on any gaps that you might recognize in retrospect, which is basically what Sarah just said too.
Mhm.
But yes, I think a 1 year, 2 year, as long as you have that timeline outlined, what you anticipate, what you're going to follow up on, and what data you're going to be collecting within the year, within the 2 year, and within the 5 year time frame, that seems to be helpful.
All right. We have about 10 minutes left, so we'll keep going through as many questions as we can. Our next one is from Manju. Are there any special exceptions for legacy devices? And Stacy, what would you have to say about this?
The only one that comes to mind is the fact that legacy devices were given a longer transition period, but being that you were once certified, under the MDD, AIMDD requirements, there's some forgiveness, I think, where you can make up for some of the deficiencies that might be recognized with post-market activities. And then maybe they'll give you a little bit of time to kind of fill in those gaps like we've been discussing. But exceptions to the rules, not really. It's, I think, just more exceptions to the timeline.
All right, thanks, Stacy. Our next question is from Michelle. And she is asking, can similar equivalent device PMS data accompanied by our own product data be used to set safety and performance parameters, and how? And Sarah, would you like to take this one?
Yes. So if you are trying to claim legacy and you have access to that similar or equivalent device data, you can certainly use it. When you have to clearly show and state, though, that you are equivalent. So, in terms of IVD, it's going to be very challenging to claim equivalence to another assay unless you have direct access to all of their technical data. So you would make sure that you're including, when you're saying a similar or an equivalent device, is this device that you have access to all of the data for? Is it something that you also own, or is this someone else's device that you're trying to claim equivalency to? Those could be challenging. But in terms of setting the safety and performance parameters, you'll certainly be able to look and see how some of these similar devices are, what are some of the objectives that they selected, and that's going to help inform your choices for what you're going to, what types of data to collect.
All right. Moving on to our next question from Michelle. What is the minimum clinical data requirement for a 510K pre-market approval?
Michelle, I think the best I can do, or the most effective way to answer this question, will be to pop the 510K guidance into the chat. from FDA. They have several different outlines as to what clinical data, I guess, key points they expect to see in a 510K, but it will depend on your risk classification for your device. So it'll be kind of a flow chart that you'll need to find or to follow to assess how much data is needed. So just look for that in the chat, and I'll pop in a couple of different resources for you.
Yes, thanks, Stacy. All right, our next question is from Su Ling. Do we have MDCG guidance on data sufficiency from post-market surveillance? If not, will there be one?
I can share another one of these links in the chat. There has been some limited guidance. We don't have nearly as much MDCG guidance for IVDR as we do for MDR. So in many cases, the IVDR folks are relying strongly on what MDR guidance has been published. There has been some information. So like I said, I will go ahead and pop that in the chat here, just so that you have access to it. Mostly it's in terms of the PMCF evaluation report and the PMCF plan template. Those two were both published around April of 2020.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question from Dalu. Does state-of-the-art apply to legacy medical devices?
Yes, definitely. When you and if anything, your approach may be slightly different if you do have a legacy device, but ultimately you still are expected to show what is considered to be state of the art. You know, we've had some of these devices that have literally been on the market for decades, and it can be a little bit sort of scary for the average company as they're trying to claim state of the art. The important thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to be the most technically advanced. You don't have to be the newest, hottest thing on the market. You have to be state of the art with respect to your intended purpose. So even with something like, COVID testing, or, well, I guess that's not legacy, but let's think of something older, like HIV testing. You know, with HIV testing, you've got some devices that have been on the market for literally 20, 30 years. And they may not be the most advanced way of making that diagnosis, but maybe they work more effectively in certain regions. You know, they may be easier to use in point of care versus in a laboratory setting. They may provide more rapid results. So think about it in terms of, where does your device fit into the overall landscape? Like, who is your device considered state of the art with regards to? And under what circumstances could it be considered state of the art? So it doesn't have to be the most technically advanced. You just have to show when, where, and why your device would be considered sort of that standard of care.
All right, we have a couple minutes left, so we have time for a couple of more questions. Our next one is from Dan. What sources of post-market data are considered clinical data as opposed to supporting clinical evidence?
Yes, Dan, we've heard supporting clinical data or supporting clinical evidence quite a bit, and I've heard it used in a variety of contexts, but I'm going to try to answer it to the best of my understanding. My understanding is clinical data is directly related to your device. So your device, post-market clinical data, is your device being used in a post-market real-world setting in or on humans, right? That's the data that's collected from in that situation, whereas supporting clinical evidence would be similar device data. So data from similar devices, or if your device is being used for a different intended use or on a different population that then was originally included in your indications for use, that would perhaps also be supporting clinical evidence. Now, whether that supporting clinical evidence helps you or not when it's your own device being used in a different way, usually with a different population or a different intended use that could help you or hurt you. So it's not recommended to use that type of supporting clinical evidence, but it is recommended to use similar device supporting clinical evidence. And then of course, any published clinical data from literature would also be considered supporting clinical evidence. And that's the most preferred if you don't have real world evidence to use.
And I think if anything, this happens to be a little bit clearer from the IVD. It's one of the few times where IVD, it's a little more easily delineated. The clinical data are when your device, when your assay is being used in a real world setting to determine to make a diagnosis or to make some sort of informed patient decision. If your test is being used on samples to validate a method, but you already know the results of those samples, even though they're patient samples, if it's not informing the clinical course for that patient, then that would be considered a supporting clinical evidence. It wouldn't be real world clinical data. So think about it in terms of, do I know the answer before I run the test? And that's going to be the easiest way to distinguish from IVD between clinical data and supporting clinical evidence.
All right. Thanks, Sarah and Stacy. We are just about out of time here. Our team will be sharing some important resources in the chat and will remain on the webinar for just a few more minutes so that you can access these. If you have more questions on the content that we discussed today, or if you'd like to learn about our services, you can schedule a free appointment with our specialists. Our contact information is consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you again, everyone, for attending and for all your questions. We hope this presentation gave you more insight into post-market surveillance requirements for MDR and IVDR. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time.